They said the house was older than its master, older even than the city that rose around it. It stood upon the Vicksburg hill like a coffin carved from white stone, its shutters locked tight, its doors swallowing sound. From the river, you could see it gleam in the sun as though it were a beacon, but up close, its walls seemed to drink the light, leaving the fields below in a half-shadow. The year was 1842, and the South was fat on cotton and bone. Yet the house did not sing with the music of wealth. It breathed differently, slower, heavier, as though it carried something in its lungs that it could not cough out. On nights when the cicadas fell quiet, the enslaved swore they heard cries drifting from its rafters. Not the cries of babes, but the jagged sounds of beasts straining at the leash of their master. In the master's household, there were 3 daughters, born the same hour, wrapped in the same blood, their eyes identical, as if God had stamped them from the same mold. From the day they drew their first breath, they carried no softness. Their silence stretched through the halls, long and deep as the river. Nurses feared to rock them. Mothers among the enslaved women feared to suckle them. For when the infants fixed their eyes on a face, the onlookers swore they saw not children, but mirrors reflecting their own sins. The mistress of the house, pale and thin as paper, kept her distance. She walked the corridors with a Bible clutched in her hands, her lips cracked from prayer. Some said she once took the infants to the well, leaning over with trembling arms. Others whispered she prayed the river would claim them. Whatever she attempted, it did not succeed. The children lived, and though she gave them milk, though she dressed them in linen gowns, she never called them daughters. To her, they were punishment, the evidence of a wound that betrayed her. And she wandered the house like a ghost, avoiding their gaze, avoiding her own reflection. The master never spoke of them. In the ledger of his mind, they did not exist, 3 daughters without value, without inheritance, without place. But even he, with his iron grip and brutal will, could not still the unease that spread through the plantation like a fever. It is said that every life in Vicksburg was touched by the triplets before their first year had passed. But the story begins not in their birth, nor in their growth, but in the silence that swallowed their first cries. A silence that felt less like peace and more like the pause before a scream. The woman came at dusk, when the light bleeds red across the river and shadows stretch long like knives. Her name was lost in time, but the slaves called her the midwife, a woman who had seen more births than sermons, more deaths than weddings. She arrived covered in the dust of the Delta Road, her hands carrying the faint smell of herbs and smoke, her face lined with years of pain. She had been summoned because something was not right. She had heard rumors, triplets who never cried, daughters who stare at walls, children who grew without sound. But rumors are one thing, silence is another. When she stepped across the threshold of the plantation house, she felt it. The silence pressed against her ribs, made her lungs ache as though she had stepped into a tomb. Upstairs, in a darkened corner room, 3 cribs stood untouched by candlelight. Inside lay the children. They did not blink. They did not whimper. Their chests rose and fell together in an eerie rhythm, like waves on the same tide. Their eyes, wide, unblinking, traveled in unison, fixed on a ceiling no one else could see. The midwife crossed herself. She had seen infants born with deformities, born blind, born screaming with teeth. But never this, never silence so absolute. One of the enslaved women lingered by the door, her hands wringing raw. "Are they cursed?" she whispered, her voice trembling as if it might break the spell. The midwife did not answer. She stepped closer, bending down until she could hear the soft hiss of their breathing. She waited for a cry, for a coo, for any sound of life. None came. The stillness was unbearable. When she reached for the youngest, the child's eyes flicked to her hand. The other 2 followed, perfectly synchronized, and for a moment, the midwife swore she felt heat radiating from their gaze, as though the children were not watching, but consuming her. Her hand shook. She pulled back. That night, she left the house without a word. But the enslaved who saw her face in the moonlight swore she looked 10 years older than when she had arrived. The whispers began to spread. whispers that grew faster than cotton vines, carried by mouths desperate for explanation. Children born together, bound together, dangerous to the ones who claimed to own them. And so, before they could walk, before they could speak, the triplets were no longer children. They were already legend. Years passed, and the girls grew as shadows grow, tall, inseparable, their steps in rhythm, their gazes never breaking from one another. They spoke no word, yet they seemed to understand each thought as if one soul divided into three bodies. In the daylight, they drifted like phantoms through the veranda, their linen dresses catching dust, their eyes fixed on something no one else could see. At night, they lay side by side, their breaths folding into one current of silence that filled the room more heavily than any lullaby. Most of the household recoiled. The mistress crossed herself when they passed. The master ignored them, as though pretending they did not exist could erase them. But among the enslaved, there were always those who could not turn away, for even cursed children were still children. And hunger does not ask if a mouth is holy or damned. An old field hand named Isaac carried a quiet pity for them. His back was bent with lashes, his beard white with ash, his eyes clouded but still tender. One evening, when the dusk painted the sky the color of bruised fruit, he called the girls to the smokehouse. He had roasted sweet potatoes, their skins cracked and steaming. With a trembling smile, he split them 3 ways and placed them into their small hands. They did not thank him, for they had no words. But when the orange flesh touched their lips, a change rippled across their faces. Their mouths curved, not fully into smiles, but into something softer, something that startled Isaac into tears. He had not expected to see joy in them, however faint. He crossed himself, whispering a prayer of thanks, for he believed, even in silence, God leaves a spark of tenderness. Yet when the children turned their gaze upon him together, the air thickened. His breath faltered as though stolen. Their eyes seemed to drink him in, pulling his soul toward them, and for a moment he feared his heart might stop. He staggered back, clutching his chest, but then they lowered their eyes, returning to their meal. The spell broke, and Isaac's breath returned ragged. He could have run. He could have left them to starve of love, as others did. Instead, he returned the next night, and the night after, always with food hidden in his coat. In their silence, he did not see demons. He saw children abandoned by the world, children starved for gentleness. But kindness on the plantation was as fragile as glass. Too many eyes, too many ears. The master began to notice the smokehouse fire burning too often. His suspicion grew sharp as a blade, and cruelty, once sharpened, would not remain sheathed for long. If the master ignored the triplets, the mistress could not. She carried them inside her womb, and for that she bore a guilt that became a sickness. She was a pale figure in the corridors, lips cracked with prayer, a rosary biting into her palms until they bled. The enslaved called her the wandering wife, for she drifted sleepless through the halls like a ghost, muttering words no one dared to answer. She never called the girls by name. She called them the punishment, sometimes the proof. Other times, when wine loosened her tongue, she whispered to her maids that no man's seed could have fathered such things. The words reached the fields, poisoned the air. One night, as thunder rolled low across the Mississippi and rain battered the shutters, she took a candle into their chamber. The storm's light flared white across the cribs. The triplets lay side by side, eyes wide open, staring as though they had been waiting for her. Her hand trembled. The flame dripped wax down her wrist. She leaned closer, whispering prayers half-remembered, words broken by sobs. Her voice cracked. "You are not mine. You're not his. You are." The lightning split the sky, and in that flash, the girls rose together, tiny bodies lifting in unison. 3 hands, small and pale, pointed directly at her. Her own scream drowned beneath the thunder. The candle dropped. Wax splattered. The flames sputtered into darkness. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her chest as though her heart had been ripped by unseen claws. The room filled with the acrid stench of burnt wick, mingled with the bitter tang of her terror. When a storm passed, servants found her trembling on the floorboards, whispering nonsense, her eyes wide with horror. From that night onward, she never entered their room again. She avoided their faces, but she did not stop speaking of them. To the master, she whispered poison, that the children were not his, that they were born of some darker seed, that his household would rot unless he silenced them. The master listened, his silence colder than the storm. Suspicion entered him like a shadow that could not be exorcised. And from that night, the house itself seemed to grow heavier, as though the walls leaned inward, waiting for something to crack. The fields carried more than cotton. They carried stories, as rivers carry silt, as wind carries ash. Among the enslaved, stories were not idle talk. They were survival, warning, prophecy. By 1842, the whispers about the triplets had tangled through every row of cotton like hidden roots. They said the girls could command the weather, that clouds thickened when they stared at the sky too long, that crows landed near them, black bodies tilting their heads as if waiting for orders. One woman swore that her husband collapsed when the eldest brushed against him, breath leaving his chest as if stolen. The overseer spat and muttered, "Not children, omens." Yet for others, especially the women, who had birthed children only to see them sold or buried too soon, the triplets were something else. They were resistance made flesh, a silence sharper than any blade. They believed the girls carried in their blood the rage of those who had been whipped, broken, and chained. That one day, the rage would pour out like floodwaters, washing away the walls of that house on the hill. Belief is dangerous on a plantation, more dangerous than weapons, more dangerous than hunger. And as belief spread, so too did fear. The overseer began watching the triplets from the corners of his eyes, hand resting on his whip as if waiting for them to move. The master, too, began to notice. He had built his fortune on control, on keeping men bent, women silenced, children obedient. Control was his god. But the triplets were a scripture he could not read, a silence he could not command. The more the slaves whispered, the more he sensed rebellion rising like smoke. And so, one evening, with his face hard as stone and his voice low with fury, he made his decision. He would silence the whispers. He would brand the triplets as his property, burn his mark into their flesh, remind every soul on the plantation and himself that they belonged to him. The slaves heard his order and turned their faces away. Some prayed, others wept, for they knew that the master was striking not at children, but at a legend being born. And legends do not bow to fire without fire answering back. The day was merciless. The sun stood high, glaring down with a heat that made the very air ripple. The yard filled with the sour smell of sweat and fear. Flies buzzed, drawn to the stench of burning wood where the branding iron glowed in the fire pit, its mouth lit like the furnace of hell itself. The master stood tall, though his hands trembled. The overseer loomed beside him, whip at his side, his lips twisted into a grin too cruel for any human mouth. Slaves were gathered in the yard, forced to watch, their eyes wide with helpless dread. The triplets were dragged forward, their small wrists bound, their thin dresses clinging to skin damp with heat. Yet they did not fight. They did not plead. They stood side by side, their heads slightly tilted, eyes wide, their silence heavier than any scream. "They will bear my mark," the master declared. His voice cracked, though he tried to steady it. "They are mine." He lifted the iron. The glow lit his face, casting shadows that made him look like a man already condemned. The heat singed the air between him and the children. But when the tip neared the eldest's skin, the girls turned their heads together, 3 pairs of eyes fixed on him. And in that silence, unbroken, unflinching, his strength faltered. His wrist weakened. His breath hitched. The iron slipped from his grip and fell hissing into the dirt. The overseer cursed, rage spitting from his mouth. He seized the iron himself, his calloused hand gripping it without hesitation. With a snarl, he pressed it toward the child's arm. But before the metal touched her, he screamed. His hand blistered, skin bubbling and splitting as though seared by unseen flame. The The iron clattered to the ground, cold, lifeless, its fire gone. The yard fell into silence. Only the flies buzzed, frantic. The overseer clutched his hand, screaming like a beast, but no brand had touched him. The slaves stared, torn between terror and awe. The triplets did not move. They stood rooted in the dirt, their gazes unbroken, their silence a blade cutting through the air. That night, the whispers grew louder. The slaves murmured that the girls could not be broken, that the master's iron held no power over them, that something stronger than chains lived inside their silence. But humiliation burns deeper than flame. And though the overseer howled in pain and the master had dropped the iron, his pride was not cooled. His heart hardened with a new fury, and he swore that if the triplets could not be branded, they would be destroyed. The air grew thick with dread before it grew thick with smoke. For weeks after the failed branding, the master walked the plantation like a man with a thorn in his flesh. He could not sleep. He could not eat. He spoke to no one but the overseer, who urged him with venom, "End them, or they will end you." So the decision was made in secret. The girls would be erased. Not sold, for no one would dare buy them. Not whipped, for the lash would not break them. No, something cleaner, final, unspoken. They would vanish into flame. It happened on a night when the moon was hidden. The slaves were herded to their cabins, doors locked from the outside. The overseer carried a torch, his burned hands still raw, wrapped in rags. His eyes gleamed with fever. The triplets were seized and dragged to the cotton fields, their thin bodies swallowed by rows white as bone in the moonless dark. The master's voice cracked as he gave the order. Let them burn with the cotton. Let their silence die with the harvest. The overseer thrust the torch into the dry stalks. Fire licked eagerly, then roared, sweeping through the fields as if it had been waiting all along. Flames climbed the sky, painting it red, sparks drifting upward like the souls of the lost. But in the heart of that inferno, 3 silhouettes stood, not fleeing, not screaming. Their hands were clasped, their dresses whipping in the hot wind. Their eyes reflected the fire as if they had called it forth, not been consumed by it. The slaves in the cabins pressed their faces to the slats, whispering prayers, their voices trembling. Some swore later that they saw the girls walking unharmed through the blaze, their shadows long and strange against the walls of flame. Others said they rose with the smoke, 3 shapes carried upward, their silence thundering louder than the fire's roar. When the flames finally died, nothing remained but ash. No bodies, no bones, just the scorched ruin of cotton and the stench of smoke that clung to the skin for weeks. The overseer raged, insisting the girls had perished, but the slaves whispered otherwise. They whispered that the fire had not killed them, but the fire had become them. In the years that followed, the plantation never recovered. Crops failed. Storms battered the land with unusual fury. Crows swarmed the fields in numbers too great to be driven away. The master aged quickly, his hair whitening, his hands trembling, his nights filled with visions of 3 burning faces watching him from a dark. He died muttering, his body thin as a reed, his mouth scorched dry. The overseer fared no better. His burned hand never healed. It festered, blackened, until he carried the stench of rot wherever he went. Children cried at his approach. His sleep, too, was broken. He claimed to hear girls' laughter in the trees, though no one else did. One winter night, he vanished, leaving only his whip in the dirt outside the cabins. But the slaves remembered. They remembered the silence, the unbroken gazes, the fire that would not consume. They told their children, and their children told theirs, how 3 sisters had been born into chains but refused the brand, refused the whip, refused the fire. How they had become something beyond flesh. Omens of wrath, spirits of silence, daughters of flame. Even when freedom came, the story lingered. Travelers through Vicksburg whispered of strange shadows in the cotton, of flames flickering in fields with no fire, of 3 voices humming low when the night was windless. And so the tale spread beyond the river, beyond the South, into the world. Mothers warned their sons not to raise hands against the innocent, lest the triplets rise again. Preachers whispered that God himself had marked them. Old men swore that if you walked the plantations under a blood-red sky, you might still see 3 silhouettes standing side by side in the ashes. They were children once. Then they were slaves. Then they were silence. Then they were fire. Now they are legend. And some say that when the wind turns hot and the crows gather thick, their silence still walks the fields of Vicksburg, unyielding, unbroken, and eternal.